everyone for joining. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ursula Bryan. I'm the Chief Executive at the Institute of Asset Management. And I'm delighted to be joined today by David Jenkins, who's the Chief Executive Officer at the Institute of Public Works Engineering Australasia. And I'm delighted to say that David and his organisation have just joined the Global Forum for Maintenance and Asset Management, and you'll probably be aware that the Institute is also a member, and so we're really looking forward to fostering a closer working relationship as we step forward, working with David and obviously all of our other institutes across the world that we're involved with in the GFMAM. But this morning, I'm delighted, I'm in the UK, so it is morning, but it might be later for wherever you are. I'm delighted to be joined by David, and he's going to take us through a presentation associated with climate change, technology and stewardship. So I'm going to hand over to David now. Thank you, David.
Thanks, Ursula. Thank you very much for the warm welcome. And I'm in a very wet Sydney at 8 o'clock this evening, but wherever you are in the world, thank you for making the time to be part of this. And I think we're going to leave some questions at the end. So and I'm looking forward to those. So look, with any presentation that I do, you might not agree with everything, and that's fine. If I've stimulated some debate or some interest, then that's the whole purpose of these things. So look, in terms of a bio, these things, webinars can be a little bit impersonal at times. So this isn't a picture book from my mother, but this is just a little bit about you. So you actually get to know who I am, but I'm not going to dwell on this too long. But as the Chief Executive of the Institute of Public Works Engineers Association, our members are involved broadly in public works. We've got about 6,000 members across Australia and New Zealand, and we have a subsidiary in Canada. We focus on the broader public works, but we're a federated model, and the national organisation which I run is predominantly focused in the area of infrastructure asset management. Now you can see a picture there of my twins, Harry and Ellie. They're the youngest members of IPWA at the ripe old age of 2 years old, and there's my team as well, making pasta. We do actually do some work, and we spend a lot of our time not only developing materials and publications and tools and resources for our members, as IAM does, but also we're part of the International Federation of Municipal Engineers, as well as the GFMAM, which we're delighted to be a part of. And I must say, when I met Ursula in Sydney, I'm really looking forward to doing some more work, hopefully with the Institute of Asset Management and their good members. So that's enough about me. In terms of how we're going to go through this, so I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change stewardship, and also try and give you some examples specifically in Australia, which I think might be quite interesting, or hopefully quite interesting to you. So when we think about infrastructure and asset management and adaptation, I guess there's a number of key things that are playing out. And some of this, obviously, you'll have been hearing about, it's the dominant rhetoric at the moment. But climate change is fine. Climate change is one component when you're thinking about asset management, but there are other components that are also keying into the system. Population and demographics, and also the impact of technology. All these are key factors that are playing into how infrastructure asset managers need to think about what they are doing in terms of building, developing and maintaining assets. When we think about population and demographics, particularly during the pandemic in Australia, we had, as I think in other parts of the world as well, we had a lot of people moving out from the urban centres into the rural regions. Also, now we're seeing different modes of transport and how people are moving around, particularly with e-scooters, e-bikes within urban centres, and now the onset of technology. When I first joined IPWA, one of the key things I said to my organisation and to our members is, if we're not thinking about the future world and the future technology, then we're probably not doing our jobs. So what is it? What are some of the key technologies that are playing out, and how will that help our members, and how will that help in terms of infrastructure management? But as always, the key foundations of any good infrastructure and asset management is thinking long term, and we say that consistently, having a long-term plan to what you do, which is difficult, and it's difficult when we live in short-term political cycles. But having a long-term plan, and obviously making sure that the fundamentals are there, having an asset management plan, and also linking that back to the long-term financial plan, which is interesting because even Australia, which is seen by others as sort of quite a way ahead in terms of infrastructure management. There was a recent report that we did, well, it was 3 years ago now, looking at the overall space of infrastructure asset management and where we're at in Australia. 3/4 or 67% of councils in Australia, only 67% had an asset management plan, and then less than a third of those were actually linking it back to a long-term financial plan. So there's still work to be done, even on the basics and the fundamentals. In terms of climate change, so this is, all around the world, we're being impacted by climate change, and that obviously affects assets and asset management resilience going forward. The bushfire season in 2019 to 2022, many of you have probably read about that, was significant. And as someone relatively new to Australia, it's pretty scary stuff. I actually had to drive back from the mountains in Jindabyne, which is in the southern part of New South Wales, and to actually drive through some of these bushfires, it's like a scene you've never seen before. So it severely impacted Australia, and unfortunately, a lot of people lost their lives, and it was a very sad time for Australia itself. The fires burnt through an estimated 14.3 million hectares, destroyed over 3,000 buildings, including 2,779 homes, and unfortunately 34 people died. This obviously also had, that's obviously tragic, but from an infrastructure point of view, it had a serious impact on infrastructure, particularly the electricity poles, housing infrastructure, and the like. So there was a huge amount of destruction that occurred. But if we just go back a bit and we think about how Australia is governed, it's very different it's very different to the UK. There's 3 levels of government. There's the federal, state, and local councils. And it's interesting that when you consider these different levels of government, the local government or local councils are responsible for they're responsible for $523 billion worth of assets at a local community level, but they only receive 3.6% of Australians' taxes. So you've got this juxtaposition here where a lot of the responsibility for the maintenance of assets, the development, building of assets, and the ongoing lifecycle renewal of assets comes down to a local council level, but they only receive a very small percentage of taxes. So they very much rely on federal and state funding. So let's then go back, and if you understand that, we can then go back to this whole issue around the bushfires. And so there are certain legislations in place that when things like this occur, the states typically step in and help local communities, and there's a whole remit around how that works. But I just want to take a particular case in point, because I think this is an example, unfortunately, where we probably didn't consider infrastructure asset management as we should have done. So in one particular state, the remain nameless, they reinstated the utility poles with timber. And in another state, they put in concrete poles. Now, it doesn't need me to tell you that by obviously the use of timber poles, that is not a particularly resilient material going forwards, given that bushfires are probably going to occur, and they will likely, unfortunately, occur again. So it comes back to some of the basics. It's thinking about long-term, the decisions made then to put in the timber poles, that they were probably based on something around, cost or whatever. But actually, we need to be thinking about this long-term. And when we put our infrastructure assets in place, and in this particular example, we replace them, we need to be thinking long-term. And we need to be thinking about, what is going to be, what are the impacts going forward, and how we appropriately manage them. That's just one particular example. As I move on and we start looking at stewardship, this has been something that we've really focused on quite a lot over the last 12 months. Many of our members who are directors of infrastructure assets are local government, so they are managing assets, roads, water infrastructure, community parks, health facilities, so on and so forth, probably like many of you. The feedback we had was that elected members, mayors, elected officials didn't really, they struggled to sort of get the concepts of asset management across the line. And you think of it from a political nuance, they are typically elected officials. They can come from any different line of work. They are not necessarily, and very often not, have knowledge of infrastructure and how assets should be managed going forward. So we put in place some specific training from a governance lens, looking at how we can get asset management more ingrained right at the very top, from the elected officials right the way through. Because as we know, and dare I say it, elected officials typically, they want to build, they want to open new and shiny assets. They want to cut the tape. They want to show, these are the things that spark media interest. Being able to say that, the underground infrastructure and water pipes have been successfully maintained over the last 3 years is not something that typically gets media attention. So we have focused very hard on trying to educate elected members and officials, because we all know that stewardship it comes with responsibility, and you only have to take the Genoa Bridge in Italy, and more recently the water crisis in Jackson, Mississippi. When you understand that when things go wrong and assets aren't maintained properly, then you really do have a serious problem. It was interesting, about a couple of months ago, the New South Wales government came out with a round of funding where they would be filling all the potholes around some of the roads in New South Wales, particularly in the rural regional economies, which have typically poor infrastructure and road systems. And there's a whole lot of money being poured into it. Now, we would argue that if there was a proper asset management plan in place, it was linked to a long-term financial plan, these things were managed appropriately, then actually having this sort of fallback reactive funding is something that's we don't have to be doing. And so whilst in some parts of New South Wales they were delighted to hear this, and with the funding going into mending the roads, there's other parts that are sort of saying, well, look, we actually really need to seriously look at what we're doing and how we're managing these things going forward. Just on that point, it was when we did we worked with the Australian Local Government Association, which is a membership body for local government, and we decided together that we wanted to look at the state of assets across Australia. And we got data from all the different states, local councils, the 600 different local councils across Australia, and the findings were quite staggering. $51 billion worth of assets were in a poor state of repair, and then when you consider that 67%, as I said earlier, 67% of councils don't have an asset management plan, and then you layer on top of that the stimulus funding that's going into infrastructure in Australia, although it's been curbed back, we're talking about 110 to 120 billion over the next 10 years. And that's not dissimilar to many countries around the world. You start to understand that there's a problem. And that piece of string is being stretched and stretched and stretched and stretched. And something that we often talk about is intergenerational inequity, whereby we've still got assets in a poor state of repair. What are we doing with those? Have we got a proper maintenance and renewal plan? Possibly not. And the retrograde maintenance is still there's not enough discussion about that. And then you layer on top new assets, new shiny assets. They need to be maintained. This is going to impact the taxpayers in future generations. So who has stewardship responsibility? As I think I've just said, well, I've just alluded there, it's across the whole organisation. And interestingly, at a conference that we held in the Gold Coast, it was specifically on infrastructure asset management, there was one particular speaker that really stood out for me. She was an elected, she was a mayor. She came from no infrastructure background. She was based in a rural council up in Queensland, in northern Queensland. And she quickly realized that her responsibility, particularly in terms of infrastructure, was really important. She took it upon herself to really get to understand from a governance lens the importance of making decisions and spending money as it related to infrastructure. But the thing that stuck out for me is on one of her slides, she said, asset management is local government, and that every component, person, within the organization has a responsibility in relation to asset management. They need to understand it, and the decisions that they will make, whether you're in the finance and accounting department, whether you're in the asset management department, urban forester, these decisions that you will make, you all need to understand the principles of good asset management. So just to summarize, the benefits of providing value, they achieve organizational objectives, providing services that customers need. So that all comes back to levels of service that many of you will be across, and managing opportunities and risks, and also managing infrastructure assets in a financially sustainable way. Another area that we've really started to focus on is making sure that accountants, the accounting profession, accounting and finance profession, are very much in tune and understand asset management. And you have, well, I don't, but my members have these conversations where you've got the director of finance, the director of infrastructure assets. The director of finance typically says, okay, this is your budget, Mr. or Mrs. Director of infrastructure assets, and that's what you've got to do. Mr. or Mrs. Director of infrastructure assets turns around and goes, well, that's fine, but you are expecting me to maintain this existing set of assets, plus you want me to build new. There is the two conversations don't necessarily meet. We have developed an educational program that marries the two up together, and looks at getting accountants, finance people and engineers on the same page as it relates to financing long-term financial plans, and also looking at depreciation costs. I think I'll skip over that one. But in terms of, if we move the conversation forward a bit, emerging technology, and I said that this is something that any profession, doesn't matter what profession you're in, whether you're in the medical profession, whether you're in the accounting profession, or you're in the legal profession, you need to understand what are some of the technologies coming down through the pipeline, and that's something that we've begun to focus on to help with our members. So emerging technology and planning for the future. So even if you think about one of the areas of actually collecting information on assets, unless you understand where your assets are or what state they're in, how can you make decisions along the line? Obviously now there is technologies that allow, you can put into bridges and roads, pavements, that actually and sensors that can actually give you that data real time and allow you to start, rather than actually going out in the field and collecting these things. That is a prime example of using technology to make your machine organization more efficient. Also looking at asset tracking and monitoring. So a lot of our members are involved in the fleet space and fleet vehicles. So by being able to monitor, track assets, you can start looking at petrol consumption, the efficiencies of particular drivers, of where they're going. And this information then can be used to make your whole entity, in this particular case, fleet management, a more efficient system. So I think, and that's always the lens with any technology. It's how can, it's what is some of the problems that you have and that you face? How can you use a technology solution that's going to solve that problem, not the other way around? Typically, sometimes people choose technology solutions and then retrofit them to try and understand their problems. That's not what we will be necessarily recommending. Another area that we've looked at is street lighting and smart control. So there was a piece of work that we did with our members that looked at implementing LED lights. LED lights are more efficient, and a whole lot of research was done in Australia that basically smart street lighting could save cities 15 billion by 2023, and the results reveal energy savings of close to 35% when the lighting system implements an adaptive behavior as opposed to a rigid predefined behavior. When you start to look at some of those money, the money and the quantum of money is involved, then this is why we're encouraging our members to look at these sorts of new technologies. It's fair to say Australia is it's implemented. A lot of councils have now implemented LED lights, smart controls less so, and in New Zealand they're actually ahead of the curve with a lot of this stuff, particularly in street lighting and in the smart control space. But Australia is still a little bit behind in terms of smart controls, and it's really understanding what that technology can do. And at a basic level, it's also how do you know what you need, how do you procure it, and then how do you implement it effectively? Because we know that combined LED lights and smart controls, as I've already said, can save in this case billions of dollars. Asset tracking and monitoring, that's particularly in the fleet space. But interestingly, I was actually presenting at a conference in South Africa, and when we were talking about asset tracking and monitoring, one of the biggest issues that country faces is around, unfortunately, vandalism. And so some of the organisations and entities there have actually used asset tracking and monitoring to look at to be able to keep an eye on their assets, purely unfortunately from a vandalism perspective, and where are some of the issues so that they can get to them and fix them quickly. But that's again another case of a problem, and then using technology to be able to solve it. Look, I've still got a little bit of time, and I guess what I wanted to leave you with is a couple of things a couple of areas where I think infrastructure asset management is heading, and what are some of the challenges and indeed some of the opportunities that are being faced. So in Australia and in New Zealand, we are facing a skills shortage, and that is, to be fair, beginning to dissipate a bit now that the borders have opened up. But there is always a shortage of local government engineers and those people who understood infrastructure asset management prior to the pandemic. The pandemic has only exacerbated that situation. So we're really focused on how you can educate members, or how you can educate the profession. And also in Australia in particular, we have a lot of overseas trained engineers. 47% of those, that's current research from Engineers Australia, have not been able to get jobs in the engineering profession. We think there's an opportunity there to get some of those overseas trained engineers into infrastructure asset management, upskilling them, and then particularly utilising them in regional councils. Regional councils in Australia and New Zealand really struggle in terms of capacity and capability. You have streetlight engineers that often have no streetlight background, and sometimes in some cases you've got people running the infrastructure assets on a 0.6. So there is a real issue there, and it's something that we're keen to work with government, both all levels of government, federal, state and local, to be able to achieve. I think the other area is, and this is not just an Australian issue, it is a broader international issue, which is how we build for the long term and a short term world. Typically, political cycles run over a 3-year frame. Infrastructure does not run, or should not be running, over a 3. Many of you will understand that and know this on this webinar. It's interesting that the national government, which has just come into, there's a change of government in New Zealand, and the national government has come in, and one of the key planks it said is, we want to build a 30-year infrastructure plan, and that will be monitored by an agency outside of the politicians. Well, we think that's sensible, and it's this type of long-term approach that needs to be taken. Otherwise, unfortunately, we're going to be getting a continued issue of building the new shiny assets, which look good, but and get media attention, but unfortunately, they're probably not the best things for local communities. I think the other area is maintaining control while encouraging agility. Decisions, there needs to be regulation and governance processes in place with infrastructure, but I think also there needs to be some sort of flexibility. Decisions need to be made. We have, and I said this right at the start of the webinar, we have got changing issues around climate. We've got changing population demographics, and how are we, some of these decisions can't wait. there needs to be the flexibility, but also, we all understand that there needs to be a lens of governance and oversight to make sure that these things are being done properly. I think also infrastructure asset managers, I think they also need to be able to tell a good story. I say this often, that our members need to be great storytellers. They understand the technical details of what needs to be done, but they need to communicate with all facets of the organization, and they need to be able to tell the story effectively. And those great people who can do that have a lot of success. And it's not always easy, because you're having to tell the story to elected members, and you're having to tell the story to the field people in the field and the operations. But if you can do that and use the data to be able to tell an effective story around your infrastructure asset management plan, whilst also managing that with the local community and the external point, then I think that's certainly something that we can do. And I think and I say this a lot, and I don't just say this because they're our members, but typically our members, people like yourselves, if you need a problem solved, you typically ask an engineer or someone in infrastructure asset management, because you're great problem solvers, are probably the best. But being able to get above and understand the technical detail, and then translate that to the average person, I think is really, really important. I think the final area is paying for it all. So governments, in terms specifically of new infrastructure, what's needed, what's required. I mean, you've got two ways to fund that. You either do that off the taxation basis, or user pays. And I think we need to have honest conversations on what that looks like. I'll give you an example. There's a new toll road that's been built in the inner west suburbs of Sydney that runs right the way through to the airport, and that will save a significant amount of time. That toll road's $11, so it's pretty expensive. And I think we need to, at all levels, we need to have an open and honest conversation on what that looks like and who's going to be paying for it moving forward. I think that's pretty much come to the end of my presentation. I did want to leave some time for questions, and Ursula was keen to do that. So we've got 10-15 minutes. If people have got any questions that they would like to ask, I will either be able to answer them. If I can't answer them, I'll make them up. And if I can't make them up, then I will come back to you. No, I won't make them up. But anyway, please, if you've got any questions, I'm very happy to
David, thank you very much for that. I've got loads of questions, but I always like to make sure that the people on the webinar get to ask their questions first. And you asked where people had joined from. I had a quick scan down the list of where people had joined from, and actually people have joined from a number of places across the world. But you may remember I said when you asked me before we started, where people might be, and Ruth Walsgrove, who I think you know well, has asked a couple of questions, so I'll kick off with those. So please do add questions to the questions tab, and as David said, he's very willing to answer your questions, but we'll start off with Ruth's questions. So Ruth said, a fascinating recent book on how infrastructure works by US Professor Deb Tichara, aiming to educate the general public. How important do you feel that this public understanding matters in managing our infrastructure for the future? I think it's a cracking question, and certainly something that occurred to me while you were talking as well.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to the whole question of infrastructure asset managers being able to tell a story and use the information, use the data, and be able to tell a story that is meaningful to the local, meaningful to the average person. And when you consider that elected members, come from Joe Public and typically don't come from that infrastructure asset management background, they are responsible for, often cases, large quantums of money. There needs to be an understanding. You have to have a basic understanding of asset management, even from a governance lens. But I think that's probably something the profession more broadly, and I call asset managers, it is a profession. I think more broadly they need to be better at telling people what they do, why they do it, and how they do it. Our members around the world, they look after all the things that we take for granted. Water infrastructure, waste, parks, facilities. You know, a lot of people would walk out the door and that's all taken for granted. There's a lot of work that goes in behind that. You know, there's a lot of time and effort, and I think we need to be better at telling the story. And I think if we're better at telling the story, also this solves another problem when it comes to skills shortages. It's actually encouraging people that this is a great profession. This is something that you're really adding value to the community, and it's a great thing to be involved in, and that will help with recruitment and retention. So I hope that answers your question, Ruth. But I guess to summarize, the profession itself needs to be better storytellers.
Thank you, David. Ruth's got a comment as well. She says, I love your Ask Your Mates forum, by the way. And David, maybe you'd share a little bit about what that is, because obviously there'll be people on the call who won't know that. So. Yeah,
okay, no problem. Ruth, it's good you've done your research. That's excellent. You get top marks. So the Ask Your Mates is actually something that my predecessor set up a long time ago, and it's a forum for members basically to ask members questions. Now we do moderate it only from the purview that we don't want, you know, some crazy questions, but very much is self-sustaining, and it has been one of the most successful things for our members. Actually talk about that. They say, you know, one of the reasons they enjoy their membership is being able to access and use Ask Your Mates, because it's on a peer-to-peer basis, and it grew really quickly. So members can ask any questions. You know, I've got to write an infrastructure asset management plan for X. Has anyone got any experience on this? I'm looking at a particular piece of, I don't know, I've got a big meeting with elected leaders. I've got to present on this. Anyone got any ideas on that? I'm looking at smart technologies in the lighting frameworks. Can anyone point me in the right direction of what I need to do? What are some of the new standards? I go on, but basically, and then members interact, and they help each other out. And the great thing to see is that members really do, you know, and that's the true definition of a profession, isn't it? Members and the profession being able to help each other out. So that has been very successful. It's grown. It continues to grow. And as I said, we don't advertise on it or promote on it. We very much leave it to the community.
Thank you, David. We've got something similar. I don't think it's quite the same, but it's very similar. We've got the IM discussion forum where people can put stuff out to the community, and we find exactly what you find. We find when people post out questions asking for help, they are the areas which are, you know, often, you know, people will jump in and provide thoughts and guidance and support and examples and all sorts of things. But also we use the forum for for asking sort of quite stretching questions, and we sort of end up amassing quite a lot of people's collective knowledge and experience about a particular area. So it's less about, I want to ask this particular, you know, in-depth detail question, but more about things like how do you define value, and you know, there's lots of things like this which have really been successful discussion topics, and we use LinkedIn to promote them. So yeah, no. So anyone who wants to pop any stuff on the discussion forum, then do feel free. So the next question comes from Harshed. How have you justified the implementation of climate change activities within your long-term asset management plans and quantified the benefits of such implementation? So I think what Harshid's getting at here, David, is this whole short-term, long-term thing to some extent, isn't he? Because he's picking up on the climate change aspects in the long-term asset management plans and the benefits of such implementation.
Yeah, well, I think there's there's a growing need. You look at some of the big climate events, and you know, asset managers need to be thinking about this now and future proofing what, you know, decisions down the track which might be, you know, come into effect in 20-30 years down the line. So look, we've provided some guidance around sustainable use of materials, looking at climate resilient materials. So when asset managers are making decisions on what materials should be used, how do they go through a decision matrix to understand that? What are some of the, and there's a vast array of products out there. You know, what does that look like? How am I going to future proof an asset in the next 10, 20, 30 years? And then obviously it's about making some hard decisions around, is town X actually going to be underwater in 10, 15 years? I mean, that's the reality for a lot of, for some of the towns and cities around Australia, because we're all on the coast. So, it's actually thinking and making some hard decisions around some of that stuff, looking at modeling and understanding, well, going forward, it's probably not best that we build a new healthcare facility or health centre facility in place X, because that might be underwater in 10, 15 years. So, and we hear this a lot. People are trying to get their heads around it, and it also comes back to this idea of trying to make long-term decisions in a short-term world, particularly the political cycles. But climate is going to have an impact going forward in the next 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. So people are going to have to make some sort of big bets on what they do and don't do.
And David, just drawing on that a little bit, I mean, you drew out quite a few examples with the bushfires, with potentially the risk, more an increased risk there. And do you think that the events like that, have they changed what people are doing?
Yeah, they have, and it's not just bushfires, but unfortunately we had some massive flooding events that impacted New South Wales and Queensland very badly. And in fact, some of these events have occurred. We're now having these 1 in 200 year floods more regularly than now 1 in 50 years, and the same communities are being affected. And so it sort of comes a point where we need to make some tough decisions. But even the basics, and I used an example with the bushfires. Why are we rebuilding with timber utility poles? When we know that these particular areas are prone to bushfires, that's not a sensible decision. It's even some of the basics. We still need to improve on.
Thank you. So if anyone does have any further questions, please do drop them into chat. But whilst you're doing that, I'll just pick up a couple of questions I was quite curious about, David. So one of the areas that we've got quite a lot of work going on is in the area of circular economy, and that's really supporting a lot of the climate change thinking. And I was just curious, just from some of the comments you were making around climate change, is whether you're seeing some of the the people that you're interacting with, are they really embracing some of the circular economy sort of principles, or is it still quite early days?
I think it's still relatively early days. We came out with a practice note guidance on circular economy a couple of months ago, and it has been taken up. Like there is, I mean, has it flown out the door? No. We've noticed actually, Ruth mentioned this last year, mates, more questions being asked around the circular economy. But there's another area, and this is related, that we really are finding quite a bit of interest in, and we're talking a lot about it, is just the whole space of natural green assets. Because if we're looking at assets that if we're going to achieve some of the net zero targets and sustainability targets, and also if we're looking at resilience, and if we're looking at self-sustaining assets, green or natural assets, and they're often called natural assets in parts of North America, and using, I define those as wetlands, mangroves, sediment ponds, natural. That's how I would define a green asset. And there's hybrid solutions as well, rain gardens and all that sort of stuff. But we're beginning to take a bit more of an interest in that, and encouraging our members to look at natural asset, green asset solutions, rather than just the traditional grey infrastructure.
Yeah, and we're seeing, we've got we've got a relationship with the International Sustainability Coalition for Infrastructure, yes. And we absolutely see a lot of the activity that you're talking about there. And we've got some work going on in our climate emergency group about sort of natural solutions, natural based solutions. Which is the terminology they're using. So.
Well, that's really interesting, Ursula, because I was speaking at a conference. It doesn't really matter what it's called, but it was called the TreeNet conference, and it was basically urban forest arborists all working in local government. And I was introduced to the stage, and my introduction was, well, we don't typically like the engineering profession, but we've got David Jenkins here speaking, representing local government. And because this profession really understands the benefits of the use of natural and green assets. They really understand the stuff. And I think there's been a bit of frustration that the engineering community hasn't always been as amenable to it. But I think that's changing. But this comes back to this whole cross-sectoral approach. And this is where I think your members, our members, can really take a leadership role, because we can embrace the urban forest, the arborists, and I was also talking about the as much as you want to embrace an accountant, but you can embrace the accounting and finance profession. And I think that's where we can take a look, because we've got to work across the whole organisation to be able to make some of these decisions and make improvements and solutions.
And talking about the finance community, it'd be interesting just to get your views on ESG, because I mean ESG is like massively a talked about topic. We've got a lot of people in the finance community who are engaged with organizations talking about ESG, and many of our asset managers as well. Just get your views on that.
Yeah, look, I think I'm going to go back. So in terms of ESG, I'm going to go back probably at a more of a basic level, and looking at if we think about sustainability, the use of natural assets, green assets, and how we put a value on all these things. And I think that's probably been that is still a debated area. How do you put a value on a tree? How do you put a value on vegetation? There has been some work that's actually been done on this, but accountants typically want to see that on a balance sheet. They want a value, and there's different approaches to this. There's a market-based approach, there's an asset-based approach. But I think that this is where the two professions have got to come together, because if we're looking at sustainability, the environment, the use of natural green assets, how we all need to come together. The International Accounting Standards Boards, the engineering fraternity, dare I say it, some of the big investors, the reinsurers, and all work together. Well, how are we actually going to make sure that this is green assets are valued to the same extent that grey and hard infrastructure assets are?
Thank you, David. So we haven't had any more questions, so we're just about out of time. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to thank David for his presentation and for joining us, because it's late where he is in Sydney. So very much thank you for that, and also for the people who've joined on the call, because there's quite a few people have joined on the call. Some of them are even forward from where you are, David, in time. So we've got some people from New Zealand joined and places like that. So thank you everyone for joining. I really do appreciate it. We will be making the recording available like we do with all of our recordings. That will take a few days whilst we just pull together the recording, and then we'll make that available on the website. But before I finish, I just wanted to say a massive thank you to David, and I'm really looking forward to us working more closely together as two institutes as we take forward and start looking at how we can help and support people with all of these challenges across the world. So thank you very much, David.
Thanks ever so much, Ursula. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you.